Hello, everyone. So thanks very much for joining us today. We're just talking online with the Berlin Series Festival. We're very grateful to have Ben Donald with us today from Cosmopolitan Pictures. We're going to largely be talking about the Mallorca Files, one of his successful shows, but we're also going to be talking about Ben's career in general and the state of drama production today with an emphasis on international productions. So I'm just going to kick off. Okay, Ben, thanks very much for joining us. So just to kick off, could you just tell us a little bit about how you got started in the business and where you are now?
Yeah, certainly. I actually started my career in the publishing industry. And in a particular area of that, I was working in illustrated books, high-end, what they call kind of coffee table or art books. But what's relevant to sort of what I do now and some of the shows I've worked on, I think, is that I sat in that kind of space between editorial and sort of international, whereby these very expensive books needed print runs from other countries, other publishers in other countries of concept in order to kind of underwrite the cost of the whole book. So, what I initially started working on called co-editions or co-printings, translated quite seamlessly into the same phenomenon in TV financing, if you like, finding partners to come in very early on a project in order to enable it to happen. Yeah, so I worked for a couple of publishing houses and moved over to the international side of BBC Worldwide, as it was once called, which at the time published books and magazines and DVDs. And I joined them to run all their business in Italy across sales of factual drama, reformatting entertainment shows. I did the Italian version of Top of the Pops and the Italian version of Dancing with the Stars, but also worked a lot with docudramas, drama, obviously, kids programs like Teletubbies. So a very broad range of television programming, but focused really on just one territory. I'm a sort of linguist by background, and Italy was where I started, and then over time, my sort of footprint there of responsibility expanded to include Spain, Latin America, Russia, and so. But I knew that my passion was drama, and I gradually sort of focused on that as an area of specialization. And when, I suppose, the big kind of turning point was when BBC Worldwide started investing in independent production companies such as Cosmopolitan Films, Left Bank, Big Talk. There were a number of production companies, and just at a time when, I suppose, it was the early stages of this sort of blossoming of drama and kind of. A reach for bigger production values and bigger budgets, where it was clear that a certain type of show could not happen unless there was a significant other involved. But instead of having a kind of siloed approach where you have different people in different territories that the independent producer had to talk to, I sort of posited this position to my seniors that it would be very useful for producers to have a kind of point person who was deeply immersed in their project from an editorial perspective very early on, and who could sort of essentially camouflage themselves as a producer on that project and speak to commission.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, sorry.
I just wanted to clarify one thing. So effectively, you sort of, as the international or especially European drama scene co-productions was starting to blossom, you kind of established this position for yourself as a point for various parties to. Is that, have I understood correctly?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, we had historically had a very kind of seller to buyer relationship in all our territories at BBC Worldwide, and here were shows that wouldn't happen unless something different and radical was done. And I suppose there were a number of shows and models that I saw being done around the world. I think Pillars of the Earth was a big sort of breakout sort of collaboration in terms of European and American broadcasters coming together to produce something on a much bigger scale than it was done before. And so, it was a question of really of establishing a whole new set of relationships with the drama commissioners in each of the principal European countries, rather than the kind of buyers of finished programs. And that requires, I think, a different skill set. Sometimes it's linguistic. Sometimes it's also being able to speak editorially in a different way than, you know, on a project, because it's still at an early stage. You've got to conjure up, you know, visions and speak to tone and craft of script writing.
I presume you are multilingual then?
But I mean, as a passion as well as a, you know, yes, but yes, passion and education, yeah, multilingual. And it was typically France, Germany, to some extent Spain and Italy, where there was a sort of this golden period, I think, of broadcasters that was sort of, if you for the right show, were coming together to make things happen on a bigger scale than before. So I guess that was around what, 2009, 10. So that took me very close to working with producers and writers, and of course I loved it. And you know, there were many successful shows that came out of that, but sometimes there were situations where, you know, maybe I raised the money internationally, but actually, you know, the UK broadcaster didn't go for it, or sometimes we couldn't quite get it off the ground, because it's a very specific, you know, there always were and there always are very few of these genuine co-productions around. So I was working on a far smaller kind of basket of projects, which I really felt that my instinct told me that I thought I could find sort of partnerships to help finance. So, you know, there were great, you know, there are shows that have gone on to become huge international hits, like Death in Paradise, which became a more, I suppose, glamorous Francophone Creole show through...
Ben, can I stop you there?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, because it's such an interesting point in the industry you're at. So obviously the other big thing I imagine was going on around this time was the people like the German companies like ZDF investing in the things like the Swedish version of Wallander and The Killing and The Bridge, which helped bring those to, you know, because of the finance, added the, you know, production values that was helpful in making them become such hits, and which changed the industry. So I just had a quick question about what you were doing. So when you were creating this new landscape for your productions, and I'd like to go back a bit at some point and talk a bit about Death in Paradise and how that came about, because that seems like a natural fruit of what you were doing at that time. But so could you tell us a bit about when you first started approaching all the different countries to do genuine co-productions? How did that go? Were they completely alien to it, or did they think?
Well, I think there is an interesting facet to being a sort of a British person going out and trying to do that, because there's such a big machine. And we're getting, it's quite macro now, but there's quite a big machine and history, obviously, of export from of programming. You know, distribution is a very Anglo-Saxon business, and you know, I have some sympathy with the diffidence with which I might have been met when, you know, you're coming early asking for, you know, help, money, editorial input, and you don't necessarily, you haven't got the same track record as other European countries have between them of collaboration, because the British television industry had been largely self-sufficient when it came to funding its own drama. So here's this British guy turns up going, okay, well, you know, he's promising me editorial input and collaboration and things, and asking me for a lot of money. Is this, you know, is this genuine? And I get that. I think you have to have, you know, you have to have very keen kind of cultural antennae when you go out and do that, and not be. It's a very much a sort of baby steps.
Yeah. Well, for years we didn't need, you know, being English language, we weren't the people who needed co-financing.
Yeah,
right?
I think there'd always been a bit of traffic between the UK and the US, whether it was a sort of BBC HBO co-production or a BBC PBS co-production, but there had never been, you know, what would go on. Death in Paradise would go on to become the first Anglo-French genuine scripted co-production, and there were a number of firsts that I had the pleasure to be involved in. The two Polish ones, I think Zen was not actually the first. I think Dr.
And the Italian one.
Yeah.
That,
there had actually been one before. I believe that the ITV, Dr. Zhivago, had some Italian involvement, but nevertheless, it was sort of new enough to be uncharted territory. And some of them are more successful than others, but they come from a point of, I suppose they come really from a point of necessity to start with, you're doing your best to scour the marketplace for the people who, where the interests, the editorial and marketing and kind of commercial interests align. And of course, it's what I learned quite quickly is that every country is different and every co-production is different.
Yeah.
And they require a huge amount of attention. Both to sort of secure the deal, if you like, but and diplomacy also to kind of to manage it through. And I suppose you're trying to allow the producer to make the show.
Yeah.
And handling that relationship you set up, and making sure that all the right moments are of interaction curated. But it was a sort of new piece of business, and there were very few people doing it. I think there was a company in the marketplace at the time run by my friend, Simon Vaughan, was working at Alchemy, and he was putting things together, Coco Chanel, Bonheur, and when we first met, that's you who's been following me around, Ben, because I sort of looked at what he was doing, but it was admittedly slightly. Well, it was easier and harder to come in with sort of the three BBC letters behind me, because on one level it put the projects on a certain platform, but on another it also underscored potentially the sense that here were the Brits just wanting money. But I'm culturally very, very interested in the people I was talking to and what we could do to make the things more feel more like what you're trying to do is pull off a trick whereby both broadcasters, in the case of a bilateral co-production, feel like it's theirs or theirs enough.
But interestingly, Mallorca Files. Let's move on, because we've got a kind of idea of how it's the line of progression from Death in Paradise to Mallorca Files is quite natural. So let's start to talk about that show a bit. So first of all, it's Spanish English, but you have other countries investing, right? So it's quite interesting, that relationship. Some countries are keen to come on board, or? Yeah,
I mean, it is, to all intents and purposes, despite where it's set, and it is a sort of English language cop show. I mean, one of the instincts behind it is sort of the cop shows of the 80s that I grew up with. Moonlighting is a clear reference, but also a number of others, and that's a sort of. So before you even get to the kind of language of it, it's a sort of the storytelling, the kind of type of show it is, and that's obviously been very, I love them growing up, and they've been successful around the world, and I sort of thought that they weren't being kind of made anymore. There was lots of dark, drama with people bearing their souls and anti-heroes with sort of demons in their closet. But what about something which was just a real kind of fun ride?
So you saw that niche, and you thought, this is people. They've had all this dark. They then goes without saying they want some light, and then you sort of set about putting these components in place, right? So
I had another instinct, which goes back to my sort of linguist and sort of publishing days. I have a huge fascination with Germany personally, and also particularly with the fact that it's a slightly overlooked country from a British standpoint. Fewer and fewer people speak the language. Those who've ever learnt it often hate it, and people might have been to the Oktoberfest or on some kind of funky clubbing weekend to Berlin, but they don't really know the country. And I'd written a travel book in the kind of mold of sort of Bill Bryson, slightly satirical travel book, sort of pitching Germany as the undiscovered paradise on our doorstep. It's called Springtime for Germany. It did quite well both in the UK and got all sorts of talk shows on German television. But the point was that I felt that in television terms, that the kind of Anglo-German relationship was sort of stuck in the sketch comedy. It was sort of, Fawlty Towers or Harry Enfield, or even going back to kind of Noel Coward. We had this sort of view of Germany that was only through a kind of comedy lens. And so here was an opportunity to sort of interrogate and have fun with the Anglo-German relationship on an island that both countries think is theirs. And there were sort of Carling Black Label beer adverts that I grew up with, where you sort of joke about sort of Germans rushing to the sun lounges at 6 o'clock in the morning, only to be beaten by sort of a Union Jack tail landing as a kind of bouncing bomb. And but so it was sort of on the beaches, if you like, England v Germany, but flipping and then it was sort of fun to sort of flip the stereotypes and create, had this sort of mini ambition to create for a British audience the world's most sort of lovable German. And it was the time that sort of Jurgen Klopp was just getting his teeth into Liverpool, crazy enthusiasm. So sort of the character of Max is almost sort of is like the imagined chaotic brother of Jurgen Klopp, whose kind of key characteristic is kind of endless enthusiasm. Yeah. So it was sort of, it was set up as a fun way to look at that, really. So we had, the kind of cop show we wanted. This is then became a conversation between me and Dan Sefton, who I was already working with on another project, but who just sort of loved this whole terrain. He knew Mallorca, I didn't. I knew Germany, he didn't. And it's kind of sort of snowballed from there. It was sort of obvious that here was a sort of an island that was gorgeous to look at, a great place to play out sort of fun stories. I think what we didn't know was how much we could mine it actually for really local Mallorcan stories. So that it was very important to us by the time we sort of researched it, that this isn't some sort of expat parallel universe grafted onto an island. It's actually, a lot of the stories come from things that are unique to or special about that island itself. So it became this triangular show between Britain, Wales turned out, Germany, or Austria as it turned out, the Julian's Austrian, and this Mallorquin culture.
Okay, so just to be clear, so it was you and Dan who sort of you had these notions of what you've explained the stuff you're interested in. So was it you and Dan who sort of nailed down the premise of the show, and then
so I took in the sort of the basic idea of a sort of an English club and a German club, and then he inhabited that with the characters of Miranda and Max, and actually the kind of the idea of flipping the stereotypes came from him, and then the whole kind of premise and plot of the first pilot that gets them onto the island and together, or he's already on the island but gets her onto the island and sort of partners them up. That's obviously the work of a writer. I mean, what one tends to do is, as a producer, you're constantly coming up with sort of slightly expendable documents where you know exactly what you want, but you sort of offer it up as terrain that a writer can then kind of own themselves and come back at you with their version of story and character.
So did you then take the pilot to your German partners, or how did that work?
We developed actually quite a big package, quite an unusually big package of script and Bible and other outlines, which we actually brought in some other writers quite early on. That's proven to be one of the great recipes of the show, is how close all the writers feel to the core sort of principles of the show. And then and then we had the BBC. I think it was actually ironically BritBox in America that came on next, and for them it was very much, they liked their sort of British crime and mystery shows. So he was another one, and Dan Sefton, and so that was the next. And then actually, France Télévisions were also looking for more episodic light crime, and actually the ZDF piece I think was the last to fall into place, ironically, possibly, but and from a BBC Studios point of view, for them it felt like a good recipe for a sort of international commercial potential success.
How did it do in the States, out of interest?
Well, one doesn't get the same numbers from a digital streamer as you can get from a linear broadcaster. I don't have any
Sorry.
precise figures, and I probably shouldn't be the person giving them out anyway. But you know, they what was quite crucial to me was that what I had learned from some of my earlier experience is that when you have a returning series, quite a lot of the co-productions that were happening when I first started doing them were these big event mini-series. So you do a lot of work to pull these people together for a one-off. What's much harder and much less frequent is what we achieved on Death in Paradise, where Foster have remained involved, not necessarily as a full co-producer, but as a sort of a key component and home of the show in France. What I was very aware of was the need, given how people go out at different times, and some territories dub and some don't, was the need to have a kind of a long-term partnership on the show. So so without going into too much detail, the kind of relationship, certainly in America and Germany, is on a sort of multi-series basis. Because you want people to be signing up for the long term.
Sure, yeah. Okay, and so could you just tell us a bit about working in Mallorca? Did you send out British crews, or did you work with locals, or how did that work?
I'm incredibly proud that it's a very cosmopolitan crew. And that's to do with the nature of the island. So if I said to you that we hired a lot of people locally, that doesn't necessarily mean they're either Spanish or Mallorquin. You know, our DOP on most of the series is a Swede who lives on Mallorca. We had huge French and Italians in the camera crew. But yes, a lot of local expertise, particularly in key obvious areas like locations. We flew a few people over from mainland Spain, and our heads of department have been a mixture, really. Quite some Brits. Our costume was Spanish on the first series. British directors we've had.
I just assumed that what might happen in these cases sometimes is that you would, maybe find a local producing partner, and then that would be, because you obviously did Spies of Warsaw as well. Am I correct?
Yeah. So I mean, there are two ways of producing overseas. One is with the more common one is with a service producer. Which is what we have on Mallorca Files. Palmer Pictures provide wonderful services, and so that's knowledge, it's equipment, it's and staff, and many other things. But essentially, that is it's a fee for servicing the production. What you have in the case of a show like Spies of Warsaw and Passing Bells, the Polish co-production, is actually where the producer does that and more. They're also a conduit for local money from a local broadcaster. So we have no Spanish broadcaster money in Mallorca Files. And I did talk at length in the early stages of the project with a number of Spanish broadcasters and Spanish producers. But not ironically, I mean, it's an interesting thing that however Spanish it is, it's not a very Hispanic piece of television. If you look at domestic Spanish drama, I go back to My Aunt's about to be kind of sort of a British stroke American style cop show. That is typically the kind of show that they would buy, and for the moment it's in the English language and it's dubbed, it is an acquisition for them. But on those two Polish co-productions, essentially there's money from the Polish broadcaster, and they won't give that money directly to a British producer. It comes via a local producer, because often, and rightly so, local, particularly public money, is there to nurture the production community in the local country. So TV pays it to Apple, who are the service producer, but also the co-producer, which gives them rights, gives them more of a stake in the project. And that's the hardest thing in my experience for British producers to get their head around, is sharing the pie with other genuine co-producers and treating them as such.
Okay, and so you mentioned as the industry for these kind of projects, would you say because Spain now has a very buoyant industry, right? Which I imagine was not the case perhaps even as recently as when Mallorca Files first started, or maybe it was just getting going. So could you tell us a bit about, just would you be keen, where are you looking now for your co-partners, or is it still the same sort of people, and would you go to...
Yeah. I think that, what has happened, and I really enjoyed seeing this happening, and I remember being on various panels. I used to get, just stepping back a bit, Nick, I'd be on panels back in the early 2010s, or whatever they're called, where one would go into these kind of pitch sessions, and you'd have these, amazing producers and amazing writers who would come and pitch to me projects, from whatever country, Denmark, Italy, Spain, in English. And I was sort of going, why aren't you doing this in Danish or Italian or Spanish? Yeah. And you could see it's taken a long time for people to pay attention, but you could see a long time ago what great stories and talent there were to come at. And there were just the beginnings of originals being made by by sort of pay TV broadcasters. But it was happening, and I would argue that it's always happened. It's just that it's just where you choose to sort of shine the light and what you choose to recognize. But what has obviously happened is that even before the streamers, there has been now a steady trickle of brilliant local language drama from all the countries, really. I don't follow them all, but certainly those that I were in, those that I was in. And I suppose with that, it does make sort of English language co-production a bit of a secondary as sort of instrument, if you like, for achieving a show. And your local broadcasters and producers are now seeing their shows sold internationally as well as doing well locally. And where that need might have existed in the past, for people to say, well, how do we get hold of a certain type of show? How do we make it happen? Well, I think it still does exist, but it's very specific to a very specific idea and a need. And what is happening, as everyone can see, is this great kind of flourishing of local language drama. And if I talked earlier about the sort of the general trend being of English language drama going out into the world, but it's our time to suck it up in the other direction, which is fine. It makes it not particularly easy to put together the kind of things that Mallorca Files is trying to do, potentially.
But I just want to talk about the casting for Mallorca Files, and could you just go into that a bit and tell us how that worked, please?
Well, the key ingredient in the Mallorca Files, in terms of the casting of the two leads, is chemistry. And it was interesting because it's a very elusive thing. And what we did know was that it wasn't a question of kind of not meeting people and making offers blind, because how could you guarantee that chemistry? You don't not just meet people, but also then try out sort of different partnerships. So we went through the approach was not therefore to go after sort of massive names. It was to do it on merit, and I also didn't want sort of, well, be careful how I say this, but you don't want one of those faces that's maybe been a smaller part in a bigger show now got their lead in Mallorca Files. So nothing wrong with that, but there was an opportunity to be really quite fresh here. So Ellen and Julian had done lots of good work, but they hadn't been a lead before. And for me and for the audience, it's hopefully something very fresh, but it was built on their amazing chemistry in the room. And we actually, we went to they blessed them, they met with us several times, and Julian flew over several times because we sort of tried them out in different partnerships. But it was what I was always told it would be. It was just instantly obvious when they met in Spotlight and went through a few scenes, and by that stage we had a kind of a director on board. It was just like, well, that's just gold. And I think it's infectious. You can see that it works on screen, and they're good friends off screen. And it's a magic ingredient that we've been lucky enough to find for the show.
And did it create problems that they weren't names? Because like this is some, you know, especially as it's quite brave, you know, it's a brave project in itself. So then to not go for names might have created some concerns with your.
I think we have a very good track record in the UK. You know, I think producers have always been supported by the traditional broadcasters in this area of finding and breaking, you know, new names. I mean, there are lots of shows I could quote where you go who, and then, you know, 3 months later, because the show's been a success, you know, they're
Yes.
massive star.
I see what you mean. Can I just say the reason I asked that is because I've just been writing this article about packaging.
Yeah.
You know, and how especially with productions aiming at big global audiences, they want those like A-list stars or directors or screenwriters with recent track records. And it just seemed a lot of the feedback I was getting was that, you know, and it, like you say, except for perhaps some like regional projects, which often, even nowadays, the smaller productions still need high quality production values in order to be, you got used to better standards. But, you know, I've really was getting a sense that, you know, for example, one executive said to me, oh, that they all seem to want Nicole Kidman, you know? And
listen, I think, you know, there's lots of phenomenon going on here, aren't there? You know, there's so many, there's so many angles to this. There are lots of film directors and film actors who have been looking at, you know, what's been going on in television over the last 5 to 10 years in terms of production values, in terms of the greater storytelling space and character evolution space you get in, you know, multi-episodic drama versus a 2-hour film. The difficulties of the film industry itself, where you're either doing sort of Bond's 23 or an indie film in the middle, is really kind of very hard. So, you know, here in television is a place where you can have a show ordered by someone and it sort of happens, versus the sort of the chicken and egg of the film industry, where you're never quite sure what makes anyone sort of put their money on the line. So yes, you've got that from within the film industry. I think you've got also a sort of actors setting up production companies, so they're then part of these shows. I mean, that's definitely the case with, you know, people like Nicole Kidman you mentioned. And I think you've also got, you know, the bar being set ever higher by television. And I think certainly subscription services that need to sort of think about the poster and the marketing assets of their shows, possibly a bit more than the linear broadcasters, do think with a bit more of a film mentality. I think you have in the UK, I think we have a mixed approach to it, really, where some more than others will be after that kind of packaged element, which could be a director as much as an actor. But you're kind of loath sometimes to pre-cast, because, you know, someone could be looking for someone different. I mean, I suppose there's sort of undeniable set where sort of, you know, who's not going to watch a show with X. But, you know, everyone is trying to carve out a slightly different niche, and they will therefore have ideas about what faces and actors sort of carry that niche for them. So you do have to ask yourself whether it's right each time. And I think it is sort of project by project. Sometimes you have a very niche project which really needs that sort of face to give a bit more reassurance that it has a broad audience. But equally, how can you find a star when you're doing a kind of YA project and the lead character is sort of 90? You know, so I don't think it's a trend, but I think it has lots of different nuances to it.
Okay, yeah, because I was, you know, the contradictory feeling I was getting was that these days people are saying, oh, there's no formats. You know, it's like the industry is quite wide open. You know, you were talking about films there. Obviously, the streamers make a lot of films now as well. So I guess it's more open than it might at first seem, the industry, in terms of it's not quite as straitjacketed by big names as if you work with local channels and public service broadcasters. There's more scope for, well, you've just explained, really, not going down that road of solely big names, and you can still break new talent and channels.
There are other sort of, there are some more nuts and bolts considerations as well. I mean, a lot of these very high-end film actors are in quite short shows that are, whatever, 6 parts. They're filmed over a couple of months, and there's no option and no obligation to return. It's very hard to have a 7-season series or a 3-season series, and hold down options and things on a certain type of star, if you like. So, but I think there's room for. I mean, I think as an industry, we always want to be discovering and giving opportunities to new voices. I mean, there's never been a better time to be a sort of maybe a less experienced but writer voice, but maybe with an interesting kind of backstory that you've lived and so. And I think the same is probably true of directors and actors as well. So that whole push for kind of making sure that underrepresented are more represented is leading, I think, to a greater desire for experimentation and almost a fear of missing out on the next new kind of young.
And so it sounds like from what you've been saying, you in terms of what you're going to be doing next is more about your vision rather than constraints, really. It's more about what you want to do. And I mean, so could you tell us a bit about your future, I mean, as much as you can tell us, your future plans and what you'd like to do, or maybe what areas or scope, you're thinking international, or, could you tell us a bit about that?
I mean, when I set up my company, it was because I had this sort of overwhelming desire to sort of do it myself, if you like, having sort of worked alongside and helped other producers with their own projects, but also a sort of I like to think a sort of slightly overflowing cup of ideas. Might not all be good, but as a producer, I've typically been quite a generator of ideas, and I talked a bit earlier, sort of, writing up pages, so you really kind of test and walk around an idea, but you're very focused on not being too prescriptive, but being a generator of ideas rather than waiting for it to walk through the door from from a spec script. Obviously, it's a mixed ecology, and there are some things which I'm doing which are sort of a bit of me and a bit of a writer, and it sort of occurs in the room when you're meeting. I've not typically optioned a huge amount of IP, but I'm not closed to it. There's obviously a huge, the cost of that is spiraled, and there's a huge race for it. And things are optioned these days before even word is written. I think that authentic, original voices is a much better way to go, personally. But I have some things that I'll never not be interested in terms of, I have a slightly kind of borderless view, intercultural kind of view of the world. That for me is reflected in the kind of people I meet with multiple kind of origins and heritages and experiences. So a number. So sorry to interrupt, but you don't, for example, think, I really want to do something in Germany now, or So I suppose I sort of slightly work in 3 pots, if you like. I mean, it sounds a really kind of reductive way of talking about it, but I have, obviously a focus on my domestic market, and even the streamers here, possibly with the exception of Apple, have quite a local focus to what they're doing, and that doesn't. I'm very happy to do that. It's not necessarily always been my first instinct, but I have a number of very super specific and regional and great, or specific in their Britishness, or specific in their voice, originality, or topic, shows that are in, a gameful development with traditional or UK-based platforms, broadcasters. And then I have the more that I'm working in Europe with German writers, Italian writers. I have things in development also, where a European broadcaster is the anchor developing broadcaster, and then we'll take it out and find. It's a bit of a high wire act, because you'll never, they're quite ambitious shows, and you're never fully funding them out of one country. So it means I'm always running around trying to piece together that other piece. But that is working with Italian talents, German talents. I know I have relationships with a number. I'm not, unfortunately, quite up to date as I used to be, because I used to make it my business going around Europe to find, to meet as many of the kind of producers and writers as possible. But I've kept a lot of those relationships going, and keen to develop them. And then I'm also working with a American showrunner on a show that's in development with an American channel.
Okay.
Albeit it's quite sort of Europe, well, and sort of Anglo, it's American European sort of thing. So I think as an internationalist, so I'm playing those three not mutually exclusive sort of games, if you like, because that's fun.
Sure. And you're very you're very unrestricted in a sense. You just do what feels best in the project, which is passionate to you and is likely to work.
Well, by the time you actually get into production on a project, it's like kind of setting up a new business each time. So you have to be passionate about these things. And I have a number of things that I've finally got into development, or looking like kind of coming to fruition, that are the work of sort of 6 years patience, apart from anything else, and stickability. Some of the things I'm doing are kind of so distinct that you just think, well, it's just a question of time, really, before someone's going to be doing that. But you can't obviously afford to wait 6 years on every project. So you have to have a little bit more market-led, or a bit more sort of overtly commercial. But
Okay, and so your feelings about the industry as a whole. I mean, sometimes do you feel, because I was almost getting a sense that with the amount of production happening, the amount of outlets available, that it was obviously, on one hand, there's an abundance of riches in terms of what's going on and possibilities. Is that how you feel, or do you feel there's maybe, do you feel as positive about the industry today as you did, say, 5 years ago? Or do you have any, I mean, obviously now we're sort of, or is COVID putting obviously it's too early to say, but what is your general feeling about the industry?
I'm definitely positive about, I mean, it would be ridiculous not to be positive about, in theory, the opportunity and the time we're living in terms of appetite for content in general. I mean, it's great that we have so many more people to talk to, and there are sort of every 6 months almost a new sort of player or platform you can go and talk to. And that's, I mean, for so long it was literally just a few of the same people. So you can't deny that. And I think that the ambition is great as well, in terms of what people are prepared to get behind. But you've talked about the packaging element, and when you see that happening, you do feel slightly daunted by that as a small indie going, blimey, how do I do that? Having said which, with the right idea, you can. I think my experience shows you can get through to some of the sort of lofty names of our business. I think what's difficult at this precise moment is that obviously there's the business has just been thrown up into the air in terms of lots of conflicting factors. You have the hiatus in production, which has now started again. So projects are backed up. So people aren't necessarily looking at their priorities, looking for or getting the things done now that they were committed to, and therefore not necessarily looking that far.
Yes.
You've got a large number of media companies that have suffered and had to bear huge amounts of costs because of these kind of productions that hit various stages of limbo or
Yeah.
problems, and it's largely only the American streamers that have been more immune to that. So outside that, you come up against frequent refrains of budget issues, and those of us who weren't producing or couldn't produce during COVID, all we did was double down on development. So you have even more brilliant projects out there being submitted. So I imagine if you're a commissioner, you feel rather inundated, and so the response times are longer, and fewer of those projects will get through as a ratio. So the analysis is that it's pretty tough, to be honest.
Yeah. And one thing I was really sorry, I was just wanted to get this in before we sort of wrap up. But you worked on Wolf Hall and Parade's End, which are for me very classic British productions. And I don't know if you saw Help last night with Jack Thorne. It's very like it's like that play, like classic British type, and Fleabag and some of these classics. How do you feel? Do you feel like I know when you think about it, there isn't actually that many made. It's like one a year, or of that style, maybe 1, 2, or 3. But how do you feel about that classic British style? I mean, for a while we didn't have them, and I felt that Wolf Hall and Parade's End was a step back to making those kind of shows, which didn't really happen as much in the sort of late 90s, early thousands. Do you feel that we're getting? Am I making any sense?
Right. There's a huge difference between Parade's End, Wolf Hall, and Help, and sort of Fleabag. I think they all speak to 3 different sort of facets, really. But
but they're fundamentally very much. They're all the famous British Play for Today. All those ones that built they're still quite play-like, they're sort of
I think that but it's the question as to whether people want those now, or
I kind of got a sense they do, because they always seem quite successful when they're made. But I just wondered, because there is an emphasis on co-productions now and international things that can be sold abroad. It was just I just wondered what your feelings were on sort of.
Well, I think that the sort of the streamer lens on sort of local versus international is that in the Anglo-Saxon markets, they're looking for things to be pretty local, but with the occasional hope that they'll travel. Whereas when they're doing a sort of French original, it's like, well, this has really got to work for France, and it's a bonus if it travels. We have the fortunate position, although it goes back to the attitudinal point that I talked about at the front in terms of diffidence of the sort of when the BBC commissions Parade's End, it's not that it worries about whether it's successful in America or France. It's about ordering it for its own audience in this country. I think there was a sort of natural attraction from HBO, given the sort of talent that was attached. I worked on that with the relationship with Arte, that at the time was going through a sort of Anglophone phase. And periodically there will be those shows and things, whether it's Parade's End, Wolf Hall. I mean, Wolf Hall, I would hazard a guess that those books by Henry Mantel are not huge sellers around outside the Anglosphere, personally, possibly in major publishing countries like France or Germany, but I would imagine they're not big bestsellers. But I think there is a desire at the moment for very, very local, authentic, lived regional stories, and whilst Help won't have been made with that in mind, it's a very good example, I think, of what all the UK broadcasters, including the streamers, want from UK producers.
Yeah, it's great that the streamers are behind them as well, I think, And interestingly, on this subject, I just heard as well, apparently in Germany, all the streamers they want super German. Focus on German stuff.
It's not a coincidence. I think that the TV world slightly reflects the political world. Not that I want, but it's sort of, you could almost call it a slight retrenchment, or at least a certain amount of pride. I mean, most of these people are focused on, these are young services in a lot of countries that are really focused on gaining their local audience. And why not? That makes absolute commercial sense, that you think first of all about how many French subscribers you can get before you worry about whether your French show works in Brazil.
It's interesting, really, and quite a nice way to wrap up. Like, circling back to something like Mallorca Files is kind of the almost it's just very interesting what you're saying. I liked what you're saying about how you're inspired by moonlighting and those light, like I think you were referring to 80s cop shows and just more fun type. And it's quite an anomaly, really, isn't it? That a light show is the sort of, the standout. It used to be just light, and then everyone's so glad we've got some dark, complex anti-heroes and stuff, and now it's kind of refreshing to have an upbeat sort of escapism. So do you feel more shows like that?
It seems if it's what I and other producers I think hear from the marketplace is that people, it's the public mood almost everywhere. So to want a bit more, upbeat doesn't mean say you can't take them through sort of darkness, but I think people want things that are a bit more. I think we're seeing a lot of comedy drama coming through at the moment. A lot of black comedy, a lot of quirky. And they're very hard to do.
Do you have a focus on making those kind of projects as well at the moment?
I've got certainly one other. It's very different, but one other project that's definitely aimed at has that sort of episodic case of the week sort of type approach, and it's heightened and fun, female driven. I've got other comedy dramas that I've got in development. But I've also got things that are horrific, horror or supernatural. I think the palette of genres that is open to a producer these days is broader, and the ability to mash them up is almost prerequisite in a way. So something that's a bit too straight probably only has very few places you could take it. But I think the Mallorca Files ultimately it's a show that's slightly counter to the, other than the fact that it's upbeat, it's slightly counter to the, it is probably Europe's most cosmopolitan international island, and you have all these nationalities on there and all these partners involved in the show. And it's probably at the, what do you call it, the sort of it's on the other side of the wheel currently. Counter trend, but I hope to make more, and I also hope the trend will come around again. But it takes all types.
Okay, well, just to wrap up, if people do have some ideas, they'd love to get to you. How would you? Is there a way of getting in touch with you if people have ideas and they want to? Should they just send them direct to your production company, or what would you suggest? Or
I have a website that's got a sort of general email address there, and reasonable endeavours, I think, to try and read. I have a small team, and who knows where a good idea is lurking. I'm definitely not closed to it, but it's obviously it does take time to kind of read and get back to submissions, and I think. People are very welcome. I'm very happy for people to get in touch with me.
Okay, Ben. Well, that's great. So I think thanks so much for your time.
Not at all.
It's a great conversation, and I hope to catch up with you soon.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much for your interest, and have a good event.
Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.